Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and congratulations on the 50th anniversary of this incredibly important organization. It's an honor for me to be here with you today. Although I have to say, coming from Miami, it was a little bracing yesterday upon arrival. I looked at the temperature and it was 25, and I realized that was in Fahrenheit. It was also 25 in Miami yesterday, but that was in Celsius. So it did wake me up coming off the plane, I have to say. But after 24 years in Washington, it was time for a change for me, but I still remain very active and involved in these issues, and was just in Ukraine, in fact, a little over 2 weeks ago. And so I thought I would share some thoughts. The title I was given is Seeking Ways to Increase the Weight of Human Rights Protection Efforts. And I realize we're supposed to look ahead. I'm also reminded of a famous Yogi Berra expression: predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. But nevertheless, in order to look ahead, we have to look back a ways too. And I think we can't, even now, more than 25 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, forget the devastating, horrific legacy of the Soviet communist period and the impact it has had on Ukraine. Certainly no respect for human rights during the decades of the Soviet Union. But I do think that we have seen tremendous progress in Ukraine over the past 25 plus years, especially since 2014. It was mentioned that I was the president of Freedom House for 4 years, and during that time, Freedom House has generally ranked Ukraine in the partly free category in its Freedom of the World report. There were a few years during the Yushchenko presidency where Ukraine actually reached the free category, the highest level. On freedom of the press, Ukraine has consistently rated in the partly free category. One of the challenges for Freedom House, and this occurred in my last year while I was there, and continues to be a challenge today, is how do you assess the human rights situation in Ukraine, given that the bulk, if not virtually all, of the real human rights abuses occur on territory that is not in control of the Ukrainian government? How do you recognize and mark what's happening in Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea and not penalize the Ukrainian government by lowering the grade, while also not implying recognition of those areas as under Russian control, to say nothing of being illegally annexed in the case of Crimea? And so Freedom House tries to carve out these disputed territories category. It has done this in the past for South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, and others, and has tried to treat these areas different, again, without implying in the least any recognition that these territories are no longer Ukrainian. In fact, Freedom House has never recognized the illegal annexation of Crimea, like everyone else has refused to do. So we want to look at the human rights abuses there, for sure, and I think have to come to the conclusion that when looking at the human rights situation in Ukraine, the vast blame and responsibility for them lies not with the Ukrainian government, but the Russian government, with Mr. Putin. This is no surprise, given that Mr. Putin doesn't accept or recognize the human rights of his own people, except when it's politically expedient to do so. And if he doesn't respect the human rights of his own people, then we shouldn't be surprised that he doesn't respect the human rights of Ukrainians. We shouldn't be surprised that if he doesn't respect the human rights of his own people, he's going to behave in an aggressive fashion in terms of foreign policy. And in fact, the way regimes treat their own people is often indicative of how they will behave in foreign policy. So we shouldn't be shocked when Mr. Putin decides to invade some of his neighbors because they strive to join the Euro-Atlantic community and aspire to fulfill their right to a future in the West. It's because of Mr. Putin that we've seen horrible treatment of the Crimean Tatars. We've seen the imprisonment of activists and individuals who refuse to recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea, who bravely show the Ukrainian flag as an act of defiance when it should be a normal daily routine. And we see this oppressive hand of the Russian authorities with their proxies, and not separatists. These aren't separatists we're talking about. These are Russians and Russian proxies. And so the diaspora, it seems to me, can join with organizations like Freedom House and others who are doing tremendous work in shining a spotlight on Russian responsibility for the vast majority of human rights abuses that are occurring on Ukrainian territory, even that territory that is not currently under control of the central government. And we should demand enforcement of accountability measures, including implementation of the Magnitsky legislation, which I'm very pleased to see this country has now implemented and passed, which the United States started in 2012 when I was still at Freedom House, weighed in advocating for passage of that legislation at the time, and then reinforcement of sanctions by the U.S. Congress this past August. And so there should be a demand for accountability and never sweeping these abuses under the rug, pretending that they have never happened. There is another area of concern, and including when I was in Kiev 2 weeks ago, of a spike over the past year plus of bombings, of assassinations, of attacks on critics of the Kremlin, as well as certain individuals in Ukraine. And it seems to me that these attacks are largely, again, the responsibility of the Kremlin, that are designed both to deal with critics whom they don't like and have decided that even being outside the borders of Russia does not guarantee one protection, but also as a way to try to create this image and impression that Ukraine is a lawless society that can't control its own law enforcement activities, can't provide safety and safe haven for many people who have fled there. And there have been many Russians who have fled to Ukraine because they can't live in their own country anymore. And so we have to recognize that these attacks have to be dealt with in a very serious way, and also deal with any infiltration that still exists and is a problem in some of Ukrainian security services and law enforcement. We have to do a better job of reporting on all of these activities. We also have to do more to support Ukrainian media and Ukrainian civil society organizations such as Stop Fake, which does a tremendous job. There is lots of diversity in Ukrainian media. There is also significant oligarchic control over the media. That isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as Ukrainians have a choice. And I think maintaining that diversity is extremely important. There's also been some outstanding reporting that has been done by Ukrainian journalists, and we should find every means we can to support that. A free press is, in fact, one of the fundamental ingredients to a democratic society. And so maintaining that support and maintaining that kind of journalism is extremely important. Journalists act as an additional check and balance on abuses, whether they're committed by Ukrainian authorities or by Russian authorities on Ukrainian territory. They also do an incredibly important job of exposing corruption. And here I want to mention the threat of corruption on human rights. First, corruption in Ukraine leaves Ukraine more vulnerable to Russian influence. And there have been strides that have been made in this direction, including in the energy sector and elsewhere. But much more needs to be done, including by setting examples from the highest levels of the Ukrainian government. There cannot be carve-outs and exceptions for certain individuals because they sit in certain positions. We have to see leadership by example. We also need to do more in terms of supporting the e-declaration that has been put in place, but make sure it does not in turn become a tool used against anti-corruption organizations, as the controversy over the past summer has indicated. And then last point on this is Diaspora and those of us in the United States need to insist Putin's greatest export is corruption. But in order to export it, we import it. we need to do a much better job of cleaning up our own acts to make sure we don't become more vulnerable to Russian influence in this manner. And this includes exposing those who are taking Russian money covertly or in some cases even more overtly. We need to ensure accountability for the murders of the Heavenly Hundred, for corruption, massive corruption that occurs. We need to demand justice, not revenge. And we need to make sure that any accountability is carried out through a rule of law-centered process. We need to see greater reform of the courts and the judiciary. The judiciary and the justice system remains one of the biggest challenges and obstacles to ensuring proper reform and full respect for due process and human rights of Ukraine's citizens. Civil society, as you all know better than I, has been really the guardian and protector of human rights in the country. For years, decades, it has demanded better and deserves better, and we need to do everything we can to support it. Electoral reform, and another area where we need to see stronger support, move toward a proportional system so that single mandate races aren't prone to the corruption and maintaining incumbents through illicit means. And lastly, I mentioned the Magnitsky Act. This is designed in the United States and now in several other countries, and I was in Lithuania earlier this week. Today is Saturday. I was there earlier this week, where the Lithuanian parliament passed in its first reading Magnitsky legislation. So we're seeing now Canada, the UK, Estonia, Lithuania. Estonia and Lithuania are particularly important because they are Schengen zone members. And so when a Schengen zone member state passes this legislation, all Schengen zone members have to implement the visa ban. This is a breakthrough that I hope we will see other countries in Europe undertake as well, so that it isn't just the Balts and the UK that are taking the lead. But this legislation is very important in advancing human rights, in providing accountability, and in implementing it against Russian officials involved in gross human rights abuses and massive corruption. It is a way of trying to bring a sense of justice from the outside in the absence of any justice and rule of law inside Russia. And if needed, it should be implemented against people who threaten democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, and transparency in Ukraine itself. There shouldn't be exemptions based on ethnicity or nationality. So there are many things that have been done over the years. I think the human rights situation, for the most part, that is under Ukrainian control has improved considerably, and there are many bright spots on the horizon. But the biggest threat, I would argue, to the human rights situation in Ukraine comes not from inside Ukraine, but from Moscow, and we can't do enough to shine a spotlight on that. Thank you.